Consider a small but macroscopic particle, like a pollen grain, immersed in fluid. The molecules of the fluid kick around the particle in an unpredictable manner, so that the position of the particle fluctuates. Because of these fluctuations, we do not know the position of the particle exactly, but instead we have a certain probability to find the particle in a given region. This is the Brownian motion, first discovered by the botanist Robert Brown in the 19th century. This explanation of the Brownian motion, as well as the mathematical formulation, did not appear until the early 20th century, notably by Albert Einstein and Paul Langevin. We've been using the Brownian motion, also known as the Wiener process, in our stochastic calculus series. But today we're going to revisit the Brownian motion in more detail, and in particular its connection to a partial differential equation known as the heat equation. We will interpret the Brownian motion as a sort of limit of the random walk. This was the original approach due to Einstein, also independently discovered by the Polish physicist Marian Smoluchowski, a pioneer in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. And at the end of the video, we shall take a look at the original paper by Einstein on Brownian motion in 1905. Let's get started. We recall the simple random walk, a discrete time stochastic process. It can be interpreted as the movement of a particle along a straight line. At each step, the particle either moves towards the right or left by 1 unit, independent of all previous steps. In equation, we may write the position Sn at time step n for n greater or equal to 1 as xi1 plus xi2 plus all the way to xn, where xi's are IID random variables, each takes the value plus or minus 1 with probability 1/2. Immediately from this definition, we have the expected value of Sn equals 0 and the variance of Sn equals n. Notice that the variance is linear in time. This is a key feature of the random walk. And now let's consider a scaling of the random walk in the following sense. Let t be a positive real number. For each n equals 1, 2, 3, and so on, let's define delta t as t over n. And the process xnt as delta x times Sn. So what does this mean? It means we're dividing a continuous time interval, 0 to t, into subintervals, each with length delta t. When n is large, delta t is very small. So the value of x and t is the result of the sum of a very large number of independent random variables and scaled by delta x. So delta t is the step size in time and delta x is the step size in space. We wish to pass both step sizes to the limit of 0, and hopefully in the process x and t would converge to a non-trivial stochastic process over continuous time that takes continuous values. And let's see some simulations. The sample paths are easy to generate. Let t equals 10 be the total time. In the first simulation, we let delta t equals 1 and delta x equals 1, 2. And here's the sample path for that, nothing too exciting. But now we're going to introduce a crucial scaling law. Delta x equals the square root of delta t. When delta t approaches 0, delta x cannot vary arbitrarily. It has to follow a deterministic relation. And now we have the second simulation, where we have 40 steps. Delta t is 0.25, and delta x, due to the scaling law, is 0.5. So now each time step has a length of 0.25, during which the spatial coordinate x either increase or decrease by 0.5. And here's the sample path when we take n equals 200, delta t equals 0.05, and delta x being 0.22. Notice how the sample path is getting increasingly jagged. It seems rough everywhere. And finally, this is what the sample path looks like when we have 1,000 steps. Delta t equals 0.01 and delta x equals 0.1. And that's exactly the process through which Brownian motion is constructed mathematically. We're not going to give a fully rigorous construction of the Brownian motion because that would require measure theory. Instead, we will give an elementary derivation. It seems plausible that the result of this construction would lead to sample paths that are nowhere smooth, and that's exactly the case. And the fundamental mechanism for that is precisely this scaling law, delta x equals the square root of delta t. For if we attempt to evaluate the slope at any point, we would have delta x over delta t, 1 over square root of delta t, which blows up as delta t tends to 0. This is precisely why, for Brownian motion, a new type of calculus is called for. And this, of course, begs the question, why is this scaling law necessary? Let's find out. In our setup, our goal is to take the limit as n tends to infinity so that x and t tends to a non-degenerate random variable. And in particular, we would like the limiting random variable to have finite variance. The variance of x and t equals delta x squared times the variance of Sn, which is delta x squared times n. Since delta t is t over n, the variance of x and t is delta x squared over delta t times t. Here t is a constant, so there are 3 possible cases for delta x squared over delta t. It may blow up, it may converge to a positive constant, sigma squared, for some positive sigma, or converge to 0. Although it is technically speaking possible to also fail to converge and stay bounded, we do not consider this situation. If the ratio blows up, as in the first case, the limiting random variable would not be L2. And in the last case, the limiting random variable is degenerate, making it probabilistically uninteresting. So we're left with the middle case, which is called the Brownian scaling. We now turn our attention to the relation between Brownian motion and a partial differential equation known as the heat equation. Our goal is to derive a partial differential equation satisfied by the probability density function and also the transition probability density function for the Brownian motion. Let's go back to the discrete scenario. Denote xn equals n times delta x and tm equals m delta t. And we write p and m as the probability of being at position xn at time tm. We wish to establish a difference equation for the double sequence p and m. We claim that p and m equals half pm minus 1 m minus 1 plus half pm plus 1 m minus 1. This is because in order to be at the position xn at time tm, at the previous time step, namely tm minus 1, the particle's position is either xm minus 1 or xm plus 1, as shown in the diagram. This type of arguments and the resulting difference equations are known as one-step analysis in a series of Markov chains, but we digressed. And we remarked that the formal justification for the one-step analysis is the law of total probability, a fundamental result in probability theory. Our main interest here is to see what happens when we take delta x and delta t tends to 0 while maintaining the Brownian scaling law. Going back to the difference equation, we first subtract Pn m minus 1 on both sides, and then divide by t. And in particular, on the right-hand side, we divide and multiply by delta x squared. Notice that on the left-hand side, the position indices are the same, n, while the time indices differ by 1. In comparison, on the right-hand side, the time indices are all the same, m minus 1. And the position indices are m minus 1, n, and m plus 1. So as delta t tends to 0, the left-hand side converges to the partial derivative of p with respect to t. The Brownian scaling law says delta x squared over delta t tends to sigma squared, and the difference quotient on the right-hand side tends to the second derivative of p relative to x, as delta x tends to 0. So hence we have derived the heat equation. Let xt be the position at time t, and denote by p of x and t the probability density function of xt. The heat equation says the partial derivative dp over dt equals half sigma squared times the second partial derivative d squared p over dx squared. Since the initial position x0 is 0, the initial condition for the heat equation says p of x and 0 equals delta of x. It's a direct delta function. Common techniques for solving the heat equation include the Fourier transform or self-similarity argument. But in this video, we shall use a probabilistic argument based on the moment generating function. That is, instead of solving the probability density function, p of x and t, directly from the PDE, we're going to calculate the MGF based on a discrete setup and then take the limit. This is essentially a proof of the central limit theorem. And we chose to do so because in this series, we do not assume any prior knowledge about partial differential equations. The MGF of the random variable Sn, that is m Sn of alpha, where alpha is a parameter, is defined as the expected value of e to the alpha times Sn. Since Sn is a sum of IID random variables, xi's, we have the expected value of e to the alpha xi1 plus all the way to xin. This is just the expected value of e to the alpha xi1 times all the way to e to the alpha xin. Since xi's are independent, the expected value factorizes, and since xi's are identically distributed, the factors are all the same, so we have the expected value of e to the alpha xi1 raised to the n. The expected value of e to the alpha xi1, which is the MGF of xi1, is just half e to the alpha plus half e to the minus alpha, which we recognize as the cosh of alpha, the hyperbolic cosine. So far we have the MGF of Sn equals the cosh of alpha raised to the n. And let's connect this to the scale random walk xnt, which is defined as delta x Sn. By the Brownian scaling, we substitute delta x equals sigma times the square root of delta t. And finally, we substitute delta t equals t over n. And now the MGF of x and t is readily available. By definition, the MGF of x and t equals the expected value of e to the alpha x and t. We next substitute the formula of x and t in terms of Sn. And we recognize this is just the MGF of Sn evaluated at alpha sigma square root of t over n. And as a result, we get the cosh of alpha sigma square root of t over n raised to the n. So the final question is, what happens in the limit as n tends to infinity? We wish to take the limit n tends to infinity. Note that the argument of the cosh function tends to 0. And we recall the Taylor expansion of the cosh function. Cosh of x equals 1 plus x squared over 2 plus higher order terms of x squared. So by the well-known E-limit identity, 1 plus 1 over x plus the higher order terms of 1 over n tends to e to the x, we can rewrite the MGF of x and t as 1 plus alpha squared sigma squared t over 2n plus the higher order terms of 1 over n quantity raised to the n, which tends to e to the half alpha squared sigma squared t as n tends to infinity. But we recognize the right-hand side is the MGF of Gaussian, the Gaussian distribution with zero mean and the variance of sigma squared t. And that pretty much finishes the derivation. X and t converges to a Gaussian. And by a continuity theorem due to Levy, the convergence in MGF implies convergence in distribution. So the limiting distribution of xt follows the Gaussian distribution with zero mean and the variance sigma squared t. So we immediately have the density of xt. P of x and t equals 1 over the square root of 2 pi sigma squared t times e to the minus x squared over 2 sigma squared t. The distribution of xt can be seen as the conditional distribution of the increment over the interval 0 to t, given that x0 is 0. So if we consider conditioning on xs equals y for some time s, at a future time t, the conditional distribution of xt is also Gaussian, whose mean is y and whose variance is sigma squared times the elapsed time t minus s. So here we have the transitional density. For each t, the density is a Gaussian, and as t increases, the variance gets larger. So the Gaussian bell curve gets flatter. And here we have a summary of all the results we derived so far. In the final part of this video, we're going to read an excerpt of Einstein's original paper on Brownian motion. Although mathematically equivalent to our derivation, Einstein's exposition is a little bit different. Our derivation largely follows that of Shmolechowski, and we will pay special attention to the physical modeling assumptions of Einstein's argument. Here, section 4, on the irregular moment of particles suspended in a liquid and the relation of this to diffusion. Evidently, it must be assumed that each single particle executes a movement which is independent of the movement of the other particles. The movements of one and the same particle after different intervals of time must be considered as mutually independent processes, so long as we think of these intervals of time as being chosen not too small. We will introduce a time interval tau in our discussion.
which is to be very small compared to the observed interval of time, but nevertheless of such a magnitude that the movement executed by a particle in two consecutive intervals of time tau are to be considered as mutually independent phenomena. Suppose there are altogether n suspended particles in a liquid. In a time interval tau, the x-coordinate of the single particles will increase by delta, where delta has a different value, positive or negative for each particle. For the value of delta, a certain probability law will hold. The number dn of the particles which experience in the time interval tau a displacement, which lies between delta and delta plus d delta, will be expressed by an equation of the form dn equals n times phi of delta d delta, where the integral of phi over minus infinity to infinity is 1. So here we're essentially defining phi as the transition probability density. And phi only differs from 0 for very small values of delta, and fulfills the condition phi of delta equals phi of minus delta. So we're assuming that the displacement distribution is symmetric. We will investigate how the coefficient of diffusion depends on phi. Confining ourselves again to the case where the number nu of the particles per unit volume is dependent only on x and t. Putting for the number of particles per unit volume nu of f of x and t, the distribution of the particles at a time t plus delta from the distribution at time t. From the definition of the function, I think this is a typo, it should be phi. There is easily obtained the number of particles which are located at the time t plus delta between two planes perpendicular to the x-axis, with abscissa x and x plus dx. We get f of x t plus tau dx equals dx times integral delta from minus infinity to infinity f of x plus delta phi of delta d delta. So this is essentially the law of total probability in continuous form. And now since tau is very small, we can put f of x and t plus tau equals f of x and t plus tau times the partial derivative df over dt. Further, we can expand f of x plus delta t in the powers of, I think it should be delta, this is a typo, not big A. And then we're going to substitute f of x plus delta and t into the integral on the right-hand side, and then integrate term by terms. The left-hand side of the law of total probability is replaced by the Taylor expansion in t. So here we have this equation. On the right-hand side, the second, fourth, etc. terms vanishes, since phi of x equals phi of minus x. Here Einstein means that the integral representing the odd order moments vanishes due to the symmetry in phi, whilst of the first, third, fifth, etc. terms, every succeeding term is very small compared to the preceding. So these are the even order moments. The zeroth order moment is 1. That's just the normalization condition. And as a result, the f on each side cancels. And Einstein defined 1 over tau times the second order integral as d. And by taking into consideration only the first and third terms on the right-hand side, we get the diffusion equation df over dt equals d times d squared f over dx squared. This is the well-known differential equation for diffusion, and we recognize that d is the coefficient of diffusion. And that's it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.